How's it going? I hope you're well. In today's video, I'm going to be testing out the brand new Viltrox 23mm f1.4 lens for Fujifilm. Now, this is not going to be a scientific test where I point the camera at loads of charts. It's going to be more of a real world test, but I'm going to be providing you with a pack of images and video clips for you to download for free, so you can see for yourself how this little fella performs. Now, during the video, any clips or photos taken on the Viltrox will have the letter V in the bottom left-hand corner, so you know which is which. There's also going to be some links in the description for some extra content from today's video as well, so you can check those out. So let's get cracking with the test. So first off, let's talk about the all-important build quality. To be honest, the build quality is really good. It feels decent and it feels lighter than the Fuji XF23 1.4, but balance is really nice when mounted to the X-T3. Overall, it looks great too, and it comes with this awesome metal lens hood that fits on the front with ease. How satisfying is that slide and click? You've got to love that, and it definitely oozes quality. If lens hoods are your thing, then you're not going to be disappointed at all with this. Now, the lens mount is solid and the focus ring is buttery smooth. It feels great for manual focusing. But if I was to compare the overall feel with the Fuji 1.4, I would say that the Fuji feels more solid in terms of overall build. Now, this is probably to be expected though, as the Viltrox comes in 40 grams lighter with an overall footprint of pretty much the same size. I guess the lighter weight could definitely be seen by some as a bonus, whereas others may prefer the more solid build of the Fuji. To be honest, I do like the overall feel of the Viltrox, and I wouldn't hesitate to give it the thumbs up in this area. Now, you might be thinking I haven't mentioned the Aperture Ring yet, and for good reason, as I feel this deserves a little section all to itself. So the Aperture Ring feels light to the touch and it turns a little bit more freely than I would prefer. It's also clickless until you get past F16 when there's a click, just to confirm that you've got it set in the auto aperture mode. I actually prefer a clickless Aperture Ring for video work, as it allows for a gradual change in exposure and aperture settings without that hard stops you get from a clicked aperture. The stills though, I actually prefer my Aperture Ring to be clicked, as it means it's harder for the Aperture Ring to be turned accidentally. So there's a pro and a con here depending on if you're primarily a still shooter or a video shooter. One thing I should say though is that the Aperture Ring is so close to the lens mount that I've never accidentally turned it. So it's not too much of a big deal for me. There is one fairly big caveat though with this clickless ring, and that is you don't get a smooth transition in exposure that you would if you're using a manual lens. So let me explain a little more by showing you this old Helios 44-2 lens. If you take a look inside the lens barrel, you'll see the aperture blades moving as I rotate the aperture ring. And as you can see, as it rotates, the exposure of the image changes as well in a smooth transition between light and dark. Now, this is a big selling point for clickless apertures for video use. Now let's take a look at the Viltrox, and as you can see, you can't see the aperture blades move when I rotate the ring. Now this suggests to me that the aperture blades are controlled by the camera. So when the ring is adjusted, the camera sends out a signal to the blades to tell them to move. Now in principle this is fine. What we find is we don't get that smooth transition in exposure. Instead it looks to change in third stop increments. Now, anyone that shoots video with a Fuji system will be used to this, especially when using the auto settings for video. As you go from a dark environment to a light one, you'll see the exposure change in small increments, as opposed to one smooth transition. Now, I'm not sure whether the Fuji X-T4 has seen improvements here, but that's definitely the case for the X-T2, the T3 and the XH1. Now, another drawback is that we can hear the aperture blades move when the ring is moved as well. It's quiet as we move from 1.4 to f4, but then it tends to get fairly noisy, and it's at its worst around f5.6. Now unfortunately, if you're using the camera's built-in mic, that noise will be recorded. Now I've tested it with the external mic attached to the hot shoe too, and although not as noticeable, it is still heard between f5.6 and f16. So when it comes down to it, it makes that clickless aperture somewhat less appealing. The only positive is that it's a tad easier to turn when filming. Now let's talk about the autofocus, and I think this is where this lens really shines. It's snappy and it's definitely quick to acquire focus for stills. I'd say it performs impeccably in most situations, to be honest. It's really quiet too, which is a big improvement over the grindy, noisy XF lens that I use. Is it quicker than the XF? Well, to be honest, I'm going to go out on a whim here and say that it feels a tad quicker than the XF lens, but that's not a scientific result, it's just my initial thoughts. For video though, it does have some quirks. The STM motor is very quiet for video and it can hardly be heard, so I do feel they got the balance right there. In continuous autofocus, it's nice and smooth and it tracks the subject well, and focus breathing is kept to a minimum. The face detect works well too, especially on the X-T3. So I found a couple of issues. Firstly, I haven't found a way of slowing down the focus speed. Currently it feels too quick for that cinematic look when pulling focus between two objects. Let's compare it with Fuji's kit lens, which is awesome for video use. When I change the focus speed from 0 to -5, see how much slower that pull is. Beautifully slow for that cinematic look. But it doesn't matter what setting we have the Viltrox set to though, it always feels lightning quick and tends to stutter just a little bit before it settles on its point of focus. So for this reason, I'm saying my copy at least is not usable for pulling focus between two objects, which is definitely a shame. And I should point out though that the Fuji 23 sucks at this too, and it kind of kicks off a grinding, whirring noise in the process when it's trying to focus. Actually, I used a Viltrox lens to film last week's video, mainly focused on the B-roll segments, and used continuous autofocus with face detection turned on for all of the clips where I did a piece to camera. All of the clips were one take. So what you see in that video is how it came out. There were no retakes. Everything was shot on the Fuji X-T3. Now, if you fancy checking that video out, I will leave a link for that in the description. Now, I did find another little quirk with the continuous autofocus, and that is when you have the aperture wide open and then focus the lens and begin filming. Everything works as it should. However, if you bring the camera closer to the minimum focusing distance to the subject and then move away again, it can't acquire focus again. Everything becomes blurred. It doesn't matter where you point the camera after this, it just can't seem to acquire focus again. Now this does go away again when you stop down for about f2. But if you like to shoot through bushes or have a blurry foreground, then this could be a real problem. Manually focusing is a breeze though, with the buttery smooth focus ring that we've got here, especially if you set your manual focus into linear as opposed to non-linear. You will need to dig around in the menu settings to find that though, and I believe it's only available on the newer Fuji models, I think maybe the XH1 and newer, so XH1, XT3 and XT4. Before we get on to the all-important image quality, I'd just like to say a big thanks to everyone that's followed me on Skillshare recently. I'm not sponsored by Skillshare, I just really enjoy the platform, and I'm currently teaching 5 classes over there, so if you fancy checking them out, you can pick up a free 2-month subscription and gain access to the full library with over thousands of classes to choose from by clicking on the link in the description. Anyway, let's get on to the all-important image quality. So moving on to the actual image itself, how does it look? One thing to mention here is that I'm the sort of photographer that looks at an image with the mindset of how the overall image looks. I enjoy things like character, colour rendition and contrast over whether an image is tack sharp when magnified to 200%. Now there's certainly nothing wrong with zooming in and looking around an image for the finer details, but it's not something that I personally do that much, As this is a real world review as opposed to a scientific one, I'll let you be the judge of the IQ for yourself. Now, like I said at the beginning, I've taken a set of images and I put them in a pack for you to download. I've taken a series of images with the Fuji 1.4 and the same images with the Viltrox, so you can see the results for yourself and compare the two. But if you want my opinion, here it is. Now, are you ready for this? Well, in my opinion, the Viltrox is head and shoulders sharper than the Fuji. That's not just in the centre, but unbelievably sharper at the edges too. Now, I've always known that the XF wasn't particularly sharp wide open, and to be honest, it's never bothered me that much, as this is a lens as well that's glued to my camera for 90% of the wedding day when I'm working. Now, the reason for this is that I tend to go for a more filmic look, and sharpness has never been something that I've really looked for in my documentary work. I mean, let's face it, you know, there aren't many women out there that want every pore of their skin on show during their wedding day, so it's never been an issue for me, to be honest. But I've never had enough confidence in the XF to shoot big wide group photos unless I stop down past f5.6, where it improves somewhat at the edges anyway. So I can see that the Viltrox could play a big advantage here for wedding and portrait photographers. When you get down to f11 and f16, the images are fairly similar in terms of sharpness. But let's face it, you know, if you're buying an f1.4 lens, you're not buying it to shoot at f16, you want it sharp at f1.4, right? So I'd say the Viltrox excels in this department. Overall, when you're looking at the images side by side at normal magnification, you can't really tell the two apart. The colours, the bokeh and the contrast are all pretty much identical from my tests. And this is great because I just love the way the XF looks, and for that reason it's one of my favourite Fuji lenses, and probably my favourite focal length as well. Overall, I really like the image quality, and the bokeh looks nice, it focuses nice and close and has a lovely feel to the overall photo. There is a vignette though from f1.4 through to about 3.6, and there can be significant flare when shooting towards the sun. But fringing is kept to a minimum above f2.8 unless you blow your highlights. In my tests, any fringing that occurred was easily removed in post-processing. Personally, I don't mind the slight vignette, it's easy to correct in post-production if need to. The flare though can be seen as either a pro or a con depending on how or what you're shooting. For example, when I'm shooting portraits of a couple during a portrait session, it's nice to get some of that flare in your image at times. But if I'm shooting, say, a group formal shot at a wedding, then flare can be a real nuisance. So it's definitely something to be wary of, but can be used to create stunning images too. So who is this lens for and how does it compare with the Fuji equivalent? So I think this lens performs really well for both stills and video, but both have their little quirks. So video shooters that don't tend to use the Aperture Ring to change exposure will feel more than happy, I think. Those that were hoping for that smooth transition in exposure will feel disappointed, especially as the sound of those blades moving can be picked up by the internal and external mic. Now, focus pulling is not really possible unless you shoot in slow-mo, which is disappointing. But the flaring, on the other hand, is lovely, and for video use, the manual focus is great as well. Still shooters will be sure to love the snappy autofocus, great image quality and the nice build. They may feel disappointed with the slight vignette, lens flare and the clickless aperture though. So a lens at this price point should lag far behind a native lens that costs over twice as much, but it really doesn't. I feel it's definitely worth the money and a great introduction for anyone looking to get a fast prime lens that doesn't have the budget for native glass. I'll be definitely using this through the coming wedding season, and I'm going to keep my blog updated as well for any future developments. Now here's a couple of further points that are worth mentioning. Viltrox are known for their firmware updates, and I feel many of the little quirks could be ironed out. Updating is easy with a micro USB port, and I should also mention that according to the Viltrox website, the lenses will not work with the X Pro line of cameras due to the mount. But you can check out their website for more details on that. If you enjoyed the video, you might like my review of the 85mm 1.8 lens, and also don't forget to check out last week's video to see how the autofocus kept up. Also, make sure to pick up the images and the video clips to take a closer look at the IQ for the lens. Hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed the vid, and be sure to subscribe for more videos like this. Take care guys, and I'll see you next time.